All right, welcome everyone to our third of 4 remote Americanist Dinner Forums for the fall semester of 2021. I'm Noah Cohan, Assistant Director of American Culture Studies here at Washington University in St. Louis, pinch hitting tonight for our director, Lerone Martin, who sends his regards. He couldn't be with us tonight. We are so excited about tonight's event, and I want to extend particular thanks to Zach Manditch-Prottas, lecturer in AMCS and African American Studies, for his initiative in organizing and leading tonight's proceedings. Before I let Zach get us underway, however, I want to let all of you know about our 4th and final ADF of the semester, which of course, I'm failing to share the screen like I intended. Here we go. Our 4th and final ADF of the semester, which, as you can see here, will take place on Wednesday, December 1st at 4 p.m. Please note the earlier time. This is part 2 of our series on race, diversity, and K-12 education, this time focused on the local history of a nationwide controversy. St. Louis Studies postdoc Joe Bartzel of AMCS has organized this series, and we're very grateful and excited for this second event. So we hope that all of you here tonight will join us in a little less than a month from now for this event as well. All right, without further ado, I'll turn things over to Zach to introduce our guests and tonight's topic of conversation. Zach, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Noah. And thanks to everybody in American Culture Studies for your help putting this together. And it's a pleasure to be a part of the Dinner Forum, which has already been, all the events have been so great this year. And you know, thank you to everybody out there who is joining us. And of course, thank you to our guests who were just saying, we owe you a dinner. We promised you a dinner at some point and we will get it to you. But in the meantime, I really look forward to having a conversation with you all tonight. So allow me to introduce our 3 panelists. First, we have Geoff Ward, who is a professor of African and African American Studies, Sociology, and American Culture Studies, as well as the director of the WashU and Slavery Project, which is based in the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity here at Washington University in St. Louis. Next, we have Kelly Schmidt, who is a public historian and digital humanist who recently completed her doctorate in U.S. history and public history at Loyola University, Chicago, and served as a research coordinator for the Jesuit Slavery History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project at St. Louis University. Welcome, Kelly. And finally, Bryan Jack, who is an associate professor of history at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, where he teaches African American history and is the director of the university's Studying Slavery Initiative, which is based in the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Campus Center. So again, thank you, all 3 of you, for being here. And it's a pleasure to meet Kelly and Bryan in person, well, in digital person. I was hoping to get started by just asking a little bit about the origins of the initiatives you're involved in. I was wondering if we could start off, maybe Geoff, you could say a bit about the origins of the University Studying Slavery Initiative writ large. And then secondly, if each of you could speak a little bit of the origins of how your specific involvement at your specific institution became involved in the University Studying Slavery Initiative.
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to start with that. And first, thank American Culture Studies for inviting me to participate in the Americanist Dinner Forum. And I extended that invitation to my colleagues who are here today, and I'll say a little bit more about why I did that. But and I want to thank the audience. I mean, it's great that we have so many people interested in this work, not only at Washington University, but in our region. The University Studying Slavery Initiative is something that I think I'm going to ask Kelly. I'm going to leave more for Kelly to say about that because she probably knows more than either Bryan or I about the history of that initiative and the extent to which, you know, the origins. What I'll say briefly is that a number of universities going back decades now have been come to the realization that they have to more deeply grapple with their foundational stories, including how their histories are entangled with histories of settler colonialism and empire and slavery and the legacies of those entanglements, including as relates to inequality in higher education, but in various other ways as well. And some specific institutions like Yale University, I think about 20 years into that work now, and Brown University, but have been key. But University of Virginia and several universities based in Virginia, I think, are credited with really spawning this specific consortium of universities studying slavery, which is at presently about 80 academic institutions, mostly universities, but also libraries and archives. I think museums as well around the world, mostly in the United States, but there are also partners in other countries who commit to engaging in this work of reflecting on the institutional histories of the institutions and the histories of the institutions and how they are entangled with histories and legacies of slavery, and addressing those entanglements, addressing those legacies through reparative efforts. I want to just briefly say two other things. One is, specifically as regards WashU and slavery. Two summers ago, our chancellor, Andrew Martin, invited a number of senior faculty to meet with him to talk about how the university might make even greater commitments to the effort to dismantle structural racism. My research has been over the past decade and more on histories of racial violence and their legacies, and that's a big, wanting to do this work in St. Louis is really, and in the Mississippi River Valley is something that really brought me to WashU several years ago. So when presented with that question by our chancellor, I said I thought we should join universities studying slavery as a way to build into the fabric of the institution and to really institutionalize in a perpetual, indefinite sense the grappling with these questions and their implications with our students and faculty and staff and with our community partners, so that we don't leave it to a handful of courses that students might select into to facilitate that encounter, that reflection, but rather we make that commitment institutionally across our campuses, and in doing so, contribute to the development of new leadership around these issues, but also contribute to make WashU a stronger partner in the region as the reckoning with slavery and its legacy in St. Louis is concerned and in the broader region is concerned. And the chancellor and the provost and others have been really enthusiastic in supporting us doing that. And that's really where the WashU and Slavery Project comes from. The last thing I wanted to say is that when I was invited to participate in this forum and talk about WashU and slavery, I really wanted to begin with a conversation with colleagues who can speak to the work that is happening across universities in the region, because WashU is the third institution to join this effort. And because as director of WashU and slavery, I'm really committed to us collaborating as much as possible with other institutions in our region, academic institutions and otherwise, so that our work is not just inwardly focused, and that whatever impact we might make is greater than it might be if it were just focused on the WashU story and the WashU experience. So I'll stop there and maybe ask pass your question on, or you can pass the question on as moderator.
Sure. Yeah. Kelly, I was wondering if you could speak a little to the initiative's origin, and particularly your involvement with it at SLU.
Sure. Well, Geoff described it so well and thoroughly, but I've been part of the University Studying Slavery Consortium since about 2014, which I think is close to when it was founded and shortly after it grew to include universities outside of Virginia. I think Georgetown University may have been the first to join from someplace outside of Virginia, and then it gradually became a national effort and now a worldwide effort. And what's been really incredible about that growth is that when it started out really small, it was a great opportunity for archivists, administrators, historians, students to come together from different universities and talk about how do we engage in this work? What are the best practices? What are the precedents other universities have established? What are the pitfalls where we failed? And we were able to get into groups based on our areas of need, whether that be memorialization or interpretation, or conducting research, or trying to get administration on board, or trying to build support from students, and learn from one another and develop systems for how to engage in this work and learn from each other. And now that this has grown so national, these small conversations have grown into full-scale conferences where universities are rotating, hosting a conference once every semester usually, where we can have large conversations about this work. I previously served as research coordinator for the Slavery History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project, which was a joint initiative established by the Jesuits, a Roman Catholic religious order, and St. Louis University, which is a Jesuit Catholic institution. They realized that their history of slaveholding is one that's shared, and they can't address their history of slaveholding separately because the Jesuits ran St. Louis University, and the people who were enslaved at the university were owned by the Jesuits, who operated missions and schools and churches throughout Missouri. And so the work I was engaged in began as a partnership between two related institutions. And that's why I think doing this work together, both through the University Studying Slavery Consortium and regionally with WashU and SIUE and other institutions, is so important, because slavery didn't operate as a monolith. These institutions were interconnected, enslavers were interconnected, and enslaved people were often exchanged between institutions. And sometimes we have overlapping institutional histories, like SLU's medical school shut down from a riot in the 1840s, I believe, and they were doing anatomical dissections on Black bodies, some of which may have been stolen from graves. And SLU's medical school became what is now Washington University's medical school. So that's one instance where we need to come together to more fully understand our history and its implications.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Jack?
Yeah, thank you all for having me tonight, and I'm really excited about the partnerships and the collaboration that are developing here, and still in the early stages, but that are developing here. SIUE is a bit different because we were founded in 1957 as a university. So we don't have, as a university, we don't have maybe the long history and connection with slavery as an institution, but we do have connections with the legacies of slavery. And our University Studying Slavery initiative is under the umbrella of our Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Center, which I can talk about more in a bit as we get more into it. So we're looking, as Geoff said, we're looking inward somewhat, because the land where SIUE sits in Edwardsville was owned by an enslaver, and there were enslaved people on this land. And there's William Whiteside was his name. There's a Whiteside Road that runs right through the middle of campus. So there is some history of slavery in terms of the geography on our campus. But we're also looking outward in terms of the region, and also the legacies of slavery in terms of how SIUE, especially with its relationship to East St. Louis, was part of and needs to reckon with the history of white flight hollowing out of East St. Louis in terms of population and things like that. We came to USS in 2019. We were invited to apply to be a Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Center from the American Association of Colleges and Universities. And at the time, I think there were 20 centers in the United States. I was part of the core team that we went to Villanova for a workshop on how to apply to be one of these centers. And while there, I saw a presentation from the Citadel that was talking about its USS project at the Citadel, and I was mesmerized by their project. And at the same time, as a professor of African American history, I was researching slavery in the St. Louis region, and so I saw all these different possibilities of how we could participate. I went to College of Charleston to the Architectures of Slavery conference and did a presentation later that fall on slavery in St. Louis, on the memorialization of slavery in St. Louis, and met more people from USS at that conference, and felt at that moment that at that time that it was a good time for SIUE to join. Our administration was incredibly supportive of us joining, and is still incredibly supportive of both the work of USS and TRHT, our Truth and Racial Healing and Transformation Center. In January of 2020, we became an official TRHT center. And we also joined USS about that same time in spring of 2020, right before everything kind of happened. I was actually traveling back from the USS conference in Virginia, where we had just joined when everything started shutting down. And so we've been trying to get started and get going in the midst of everything else that's happening. And then made contact with Geoff and have started these collaborations, and really looking forward to where we go from here.
Thank you so much. And that moves well into a sort of question I have, that USS describes itself as a consortium, right? So I'm interested in, what does that mean for cross-campus collaboration? And is the St. Louis region or unique in this regional or city-based collective of institutions working collaboratively, or are there comparable things that you know of that are happening in, say, Atlanta or Greensboro, right? Is there this type of regional collaborative work happening elsewhere, and what might be specific about doing it in this region?
I can chime in here. I think we're beginning to see some of these regional collaboratives take shape, and we're among the first. They may not be formalized, but for example, Georgetown University in the DC area had a network of enslavement with different high schools nearby, Gonzaga College Prep, Visitation Academy, and the enslavers at those institutions exchanged enslaved people among the institution. And when you look at their working group reports, you can see that members of each institution were involved in informing their examination of their history and the responses that they're engaging in now. And similarly, before my time ended with the Slavery History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project, we began working religiously with the Archdiocese of St. Louis to build a network of Catholic religious orders and institutions who shared in this history of slaveholding, to begin approaching this work together, knowing that so much of the history in the Missouri region overlapped.
Yeah, we were the first university in Illinois to join, and the second in the region after SLU. And you know, we are in Illinois, but we also very much see ourselves as part of the St. Louis region, and working across the river on both sides of the river. Just as slavery moved on both sides of the river, I think is really important. And so I think formalizing and creating this collaboration can be very productive.
I think, you know, what Kelly said earlier about the history of USS is also important in relation to this question of what does it mean to be a consortium. I've been able to attend one or two of the conferences that just a couple of the conferences that partner institutions hold. And when these conferences are held, the USS sends out to all the partner institutions information about the convening and invites people to participate. You know, Bryan shared how he went to the Citadel's meeting and learned about this initiative, learned practices, strategies that he could bring back to his institution. I think that's a fundamental way that the consortium works substantively, is by networking people and ideas, and demonstrating, really inspiring each other. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, about UVA's recent completion of its memorial to enslaved laborers, which is really creating a powerful model for other institutions to consider as they think about, how do we build into our commemorative landscape this reckoning work, not only the storytelling, but how do we create a space for teaching and learning, and where people can come together literally in groups, and a site of conscience that can help us heal. And it is a, and you see a number of institutions. I was listening to the Yale and slavery conference a couple of days ago, where the president committed to a public memorial and a number of other initiatives, I think, that are undoubtedly going to be inspired by what's happening at UVA. Another example is the, beyond just the sort of sharing of information and strategies, is the another example of a kind of substantive integration is the On These Grounds initiative that's funded by the Mellon Foundation. This is an effort to create an integrated digital archive of the materials that are coming out through universities studying slavery research at different institutions. And this also relates to something Kelly was saying about, how this institution did not work in isolation at specific places, but it was really integrated, in the way that our economy is integrated. And so the On These Grounds project, which is just getting underway, will make it possible for researchers at a place like WashU to, say, find documents that are in the repository of another participating institution and access that material and use it in research and in teaching and engagement. The next symposium, I'll put a link in the chat to the next. You mentioned other places. I think you mentioned North Carolina. The next, the 2022 symposium for universities studying slavery is a multi-institutional collaboration, which I think is increasingly seems to be the case. This one is a partnership between Guilford College in Greensboro, North Carolina, and Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem. North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University is also participating in that. This is an historically Black college in that region. I'm excited about the possibility that we will, at some point down the road, host a symposium here in St. Louis that involves a number of participating institutions, including the academic institutions we're talking about tonight, but also I was at Missouri History Museum yesterday, and the public historians there are very interested in partnering in programming around something like that. So I think we're going to be able to do something that is, I think, broadly collaborative, and I think because of that, more impactful and meaningful for our region.
Thank you so much. I'm struck by. I understand part of the initiative is to broaden and broadly reckon with slavery and its legacies in our region and at our respective institutions. But one of the things I've thought about when I hear the word reckoning come up so much is how capacious of a word reckoning is, how many different things it could mean. So I'm wondering how you all are thinking about reckoning. What does it look like to reckon with our history in this way?
Well, I can just start by saying that in the case of our project, our project really got underway with formal approval and so forth from the administration at the end of last spring, and in our plan for this project, we really emphasize the need to begin with foundational research. We really need to investigate our story and to revisit the stories we've told, the kind of selective memory we've had about WashU's early history. WashU, being founded in 1853 and beginning the downtown St. Louis area, literally in the shadows of the old courthouse and in the midst of the Dred and Harriet Scott cases, among many other freedom suits. And we haven't really grappled with what it means to be a university that grows in that context, a context where the US Supreme Court ultimately declares, only 4 years after our founding, that African Americans were not contemplated as citizens to be protected, were protected by the U.S. Constitution. How did that shape the institution? Not only things like its curriculum and labor dynamics, but values and the relationship that the university developed with the city of St. Louis generally, and particularly with Black St. Louis over time. And we really don't know. We don't have a depth of insight into that. And I think I'm starting there with the response to your question, because I think we need that story. We need that insight to inform the ways to inform our capacious thinking about reckoning and the various ways that we are implicated in this history and legacy of racialized violence.
Yeah, I am to kind of build off of what Geoff was saying. Truth telling is the centerpiece of our Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Center, and that includes truth telling about our own institutions, right, and telling hard truths about our own institution. Challenging the narrative and creating narrative change, right? Which includes, as I said, we were founded in 1957, and oftentimes what people don't realize is we were founded in East St. Louis. Our first campuses were in East St. Louis and Alton, and then in 1965 moved to Edwardsville. We still have the East St. Louis Higher Ed Center, and we still have the dental school in Alton, but the majority of the campus is in Edwardsville. And asking the hard questions about the impacts of that move, of us moving from East St. Louis to Edwardsville, as white flight was happening, as legacies of, racial discrimination and segregation were happening, and challenging ourselves as an institution to look at maybe the harm that we caused as an institution and tell those hard truths. So that's I think foundationally where we're beginning with our project.
Much like Geoff and Bryan, we began with needing to do research to know the history we were reckoning with. What people knew in public conversations was really limited, and there was a lot of mythology. So the popular understanding was that there were 6 people enslaved at SLU in this region, and that people like to say they were contented to be enslaved to the Jesuits, and that they were either freed before the abolition of slavery or they petitioned to stay with the Jesuits after slavery's abolition. And when we engaged in our research, we learned that none of this was true, that the Jesuits enslaved more than 70 people in this region, that enslaved people were not contented, that they worked together to cultivate creative ways to resist their enslavement, and that they were doing everything, petitioning for freedom, running away, suing for freedom, buying their freedom, trying to push back against their enslavement, and that the Jesuits were just as cruel of slaveholders as anyone else. As we began to grow in our research and began to learn a fuller story, we began to involve more of the community into our efforts. We began reaching out, posting what we knew, and inviting people to share what they might know or to engage in our work as volunteers, interns, and staff. And a key goal in our work was to ensure that we, as the perpetrating institution, not anticipate or dictate possible solutions, because we believed we could have a broader and more creative range of responses by involving the larger community, and especially by involving descendant communities within our institutions, in the neighborhoods surrounding our institutions that are affected by our development and growth, and especially people who descend directly from people enslaved by the institution or who experienced racism from the institution. So we created a working group to begin these conversations, and those conversations are still ongoing, and I look forward to hearing what the results will be.
Thank you. So how are some of these the insights you're coming to manifesting? How are you publicizing, right? Or are we still in a examination exploration phase. I'm wondering how you see the research manifesting as something that can be made available to the public, whether that be the university public or the broader region.
Well, I'll say about our project, we're pretty soon we'll be publishing our project website. We've been working on this, I've been working on this with some of our key partners, particularly in the libraries and in data services. A major priority for me in terms of getting this project off the ground was to build strong partnerships through the libraries, not only special collections and archives, but the digital library, because this is how the project will have a permanence in the fabric of our institution, by not being something that resides on a faculty member's computer or, and that's sort of contingent on the presence of that person, as the kind of keeper of the information. Another thing, so related to that, we are, myself and colleagues like Carl Craver in philosophy and Ivor Bernstein in history and others are working with students in courses and outside of courses to develop research projects, but also creative projects that are grappling with aspects of these entanglements. The revisiting the stories of our founders, for example, or the landscape backstories of the WashU downtown campus and now in the Danforth campus. Investigating aspects of the history of the medical school that Kelly spoke to briefly, and our institution's complicity in the estrangement, the medical estrangement of African Americans, the sort of distrust that persists today, and disinclination towards trust and utilization of medical institutions and professions and so forth. We were investigating aspects of that relationship in terms of how this will present itself. Various, I think a major way will be through digital projects that students are doing. Some students are working on, we have some story maps, for example, that students have developed that tell stories in an accessible and compelling way about, things like the slave holding and selling and so forth of Henry Shaw, who was was key to the development of the botany department here, which then became biology. There's a story map a student I met with this morning developed in a class with Carl Craver last year that recovers some of that story through the experiences of an enslaved woman who, with others, sought freedom through escape in the 19th century. So we'll use the website to kind of push these stories out. We're building a bank of stories, really, discrete stories about things that will allow us to have both broad coverage of, the various issues that we are really wanting to deal with, but also to group stories in ways that help us develop depth of insight in particular areas. One other thing I'll mention, and I'll share this this tool in the chat is the work that Carl and his team, including the Humanities Digital Workshop at WashU, developed a web-based compilation of data sets that can be used to identify histories of slavery in St. Louis. You can enter a person's name and see if they're listed in the census or the manumission records or other records that they've compiled so far as individuals who were enslaved or individuals who were enslavers, who were involved in manumissions and so forth. And that's going to facilitate not only the sort of project research, but a broader, anyone can use the tool to learn more about those limited but important data sources. So we're going to rely on those communication mechanisms. And then finally, I want to mention how the importance of events that will be more broadly engaging, like this conversation, but also, exhibitions and symposium we talked about. We're working on the development of a tour, which I'll maybe say more about in a bit, but how do we bring people into these spaces that we're learning about and use that encounter educationally and otherwise, and not just students and parents and so forth, but other stakeholders and partners in our region.
Thank you, Geoff.
So we found that once the research begins, there really is no end, and there are so many ways we can engage people in doing that work. One of the things we did, much like Geoff described, is start scanning records that we found that were relevant to this history to create a web archive. But knowing this would be a long time to develop, we created a website that started sharing some of the historical narratives we were uncovering and noting that we would constantly update it as we found more. I'm going to share this in the chat. And this is another place where I think a partnership like ours is so valuable. We talked about how slavery isn't siloed, it isn't isolated, and neither are records about slavery and racism in Missouri. So you can't just go to SLU archives and find the collection on SLU and slavery, and there are all the answers. We had to look in city archives, state archives, in WashU's archives, and many other places to piece together the full story. And so I think one way we can come together is to bring these records together online in a way that people can look across institutional archives to see a more complete picture of enslavement institutionally in our region. Other ways we engage with the community, we're hosting walking tours about slavery, SLU, and the Jesuits. We led classes where students, much like Geoff's students, made historical timelines that told the story of enslavement at SLU. They drafted and discussed plans of what they envisioned a memorial to enslaved people on campus might look like. And we had students and volunteers translating records for us, transcribing them so that when they go online, there's plain text to go with the written script. And we did a lot of public lectures and engagements and formed a partnership with the St. Louis African American History and Genealogy Society so that they could lend their expertise with us to begin connecting with descendants of people who were enslaved at SLU.
Bryan, did you want to add anything about how the research that you've been doing at SIUE has been taking shape in public discourse? I think we got you. You're muted, I think. All right, well, Bryan, we can't hear you, so we'll give you a second maybe to check it out. But I really appreciate you are both of Kelly and Geoff speaking to how you're engaging students, as well as how you're engaging with institutions, local public institutions or institutions beyond the university when we're thinking about reckoning with the relationship between institutional histories of slavery. Obviously, we're thinking about those entanglements towards the broader public of the region. One thing that I was interested in, Geoff and I had a brief conversation about this, was how are you, or how do you envision creating participation beyond the disciplines who are often more involved in critically exploring questions of race and the legacies of slavery, American culture studies, Black studies, sociology, history. How do you get other sectors on campus, the medical school, the law school, things like that, involved who maybe are historically not as focused on these sets of questions?
Well, this has been one of the challenges with this project has been to. There are a number of parts of the challenge, but I guess I'll start with the good news. The good news is that probably far more so, undoubtedly far more so than when places like UVA and Yale and others, started doing this work. Today, there is interest in grappling with structural racism across disciplines in a way that just wasn't the case. You know, at earlier parts in my academic career, and even in my own field of sociology, where you know, the study of race was often treated dismissively as somehow not serious or rigorous and important. And thankfully, we are, I think, past that as a society now, for the most part. Other people hold on to that, you know, that desire. But so that makes it somewhat easier to engage colleagues in fields like computer science, or you know, think about computer science, for example. The visibility of the problem of algorithmic bias, for instance, and the toxic cultures of Silicon Valley and that sort of thing have made that field more open to an understanding of how engagement with WashU and slavery, or any of these other universities studying slavery projects, is meaningful to students in a field like that. So that's the good news. I think it is still a challenge, though, in a couple of ways. One is that you know, there is a legacy to this history of looking away, of this sort of determination, you know, the political scientists to call motivated ignorance, you know, this determination to not know about structural racism, this investment in color blindness, which is not, you know, academics have not been immune from. And, you know, after the killing of George Floyd, several of us here at WashU received an email from the teaching center saying that they're receiving a lot of inquiries from faculty who suddenly want to talk about race in their courses, but they don't know what to do. And can the teaching center support them in doing that? I'm glad that they became interested. But the reality is, you know, we all know as academics, you can't just sort of download, you know, a sort of capacity to understand race in relation to the questions that you're grappling with in your field, you know, field like computer science or whatever field it is, biology. It really is something that you hone through your own study and practice. So that's one part of the challenge, is we're not, you know, this is similarly being faced right now with in secondary schools, where they're, you know, the College Board is on the verge of approving AP African American Studies at the high school level, and is dealing with the fact that many high schools are not prepared to teach African American studies in any depth, particularly beyond African American history, you know, in the context of, say, literature or music or other fields, and in this interdisciplinary field of Black studies. So we face that also at the university level, and that's a and that's a challenge in terms of your question. Another challenge is that not every field it's not normative in every field to engage in collaborative work and sort of team-based work, and I think that's a challenge, especially in some of the humanities fields, where there's this kind of model of the individual heroic scholar who kind of, you know, works in isolation and develops these groundbreaking insights. It's hard it can be challenging to adapt that sensibility to a more engaged and collaborative project like universities studying slavery. But that being said, there is just, I'm finding on our campus, I'd love to hear what my co-panelists have to say. I'm finding on our campus tremendous enthusiasm and eagerness to figure out ways to take up this initiative. You know, I've talked with faculty in French, and I had a meeting yesterday with the director of the Medical Humanities Project, and we talked about some of these issues that Kelly raised. How do we incorporate this grappling with the history of WashU medical school in contemporary education of undergraduate and professional students and so on. So it's a challenge, but I think I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to extend this initiative across the full footprint of the institution.
I apologize for my technical difficulties before. All my buttons disappeared and I was muted and couldn't get unmuted, so I apologize for that. Kind of tying the last couple of questions, I was still able to hear everyone, so kind of able to tying the last couple of questions together in terms of kind of outreach that we're doing, or how we're getting this into the public, and then also in terms of interdisciplinary activity that we're doing. again, at SIUE, ours is all part of the TRHT framework. And in TRHT, we have like the Hidden Histories Narrative Change Project, which is working with community partners. We have an e-stories project that's based on kind of the Humans of New York and the Humans of St. Louis project that encompasses not just stories from community members, but encompasses things like theater arts. One of our core team members, the director of our Black Studies program, is a theater professor. And so we're incorporating theater and dance and things like that, as well as oral histories, sociology. In USS, we host the Sankofa Lecture and Discussion Series, which is a monthly discussion series that we have during the school year, where we've had everything from a discussion on slavery in Southern Illinois to misperceptions of East St. Louis. We had a night dedicated with a couple of new SIUE faculty members who are East St. Louis natives and other East St. Louis community members discussing misperceptions of East St. Louis as a place, right? And trying to change that narrative. One of our core team members is from I Am East St. Louis, the magazine. And so she works very closely with us in terms of this narrative change piece and questioning these kind of hidden racial histories of the Metro East in some sense, right? And challenging these. In terms of people from across disciplines, we've just added a core team member, and a way to institutionalize kind of what we're doing is we've just added a core team member from philosophy who is also the chair of the university's general education program. So we can start figuring out ways to incorporate what we're doing in SIUE's general education program. We have one of our historians is going to teach a senior project class where our seniors do their senior project, and it's going to all be based around Whiteside. And all the seniors for their senior project in this section are going to be studying Whiteside and slavery here on the ground that was SIUE, right? We had a student do a digital history project on Whiteside a few years ago as his senior project. So we're trying to find all these different ways to both connect with our community partners as well as institutionalize the different things that we're doing. In kind of similar ways that Geoff was talking about.
Thank you. Kelly.
Sure, my answer might be a little roundabout because I'm still thinking through it, but I found myself surprised when we were doing the work at SLU that many of the groups that first reached out to us were outside of the humanities. We had someone come to us from the medical ethics part of SLU saying they were working on a paper about the robbing of Black cemeteries for the purposes of anatomical dissection and research at SLU, and asking us questions about like how do we further this work in places like medicine? How do we further this work in mathematics? And I don't know if we necessarily figured out the answers yet, but I was so glad to see that it was happening. And I keep thinking about I recently had the opportunity to review a copy of the 1619 Project book that's coming out this month. And I was struck by how clearly all of the authors laid out these direct connections between slavery and racism in healthcare, slavery and racial inequalities in business and economics, and all of these different systemic inequalities we experience today. And I kept thinking about how much we all need each other. Like doctors and lawyers and business people, they need historians and people in the humanities to teach us this history of inequity. But I, as a historian, I can't solve the racial inequities in healthcare. We need to learn from each other, and we need to work together to begin having those conversations about how we break down stereotypes that cause discrimination in healthcare, that cause differences in employment rate and things like that. And I hope that as we work to cross these institutions, departments and disciplines, we can begin to come up with more creative solutions.
Yeah, I think, and again, we're still working through all this, right? We're like a year and a half old in the middle of a pandemic. So we're still trying to work through all this as well. But the way I envision USS here at SIUE is to almost be a clearinghouse for these ideas, right? I want us to be the first place people across disciplines have these ideas that we can facilitate or that we can seed. They come to us and we can match people up. We can help create these, student faculty collaborations, connect students and faculty with community partners, again, within the framework of our TRHT center, which is already doing this work. USS can be a piece of that in helping facilitate these collaborations.
Thank you so much. Those are incredibly encouraging answers too. Before I pivot to allowing there to be some Q&A, and with that said, please do post your questions and we will read them out and address them. But before I pivot to that, I did want to give you all an opportunity, if there's any forthcoming events or new developments that you might want to mention and plug before we turn to answering some questions.
Yeah, well, let me start with the thing I'm most excited about, which is that Kelly mentioned that she was no longer with the SLU project and recently completed her PhD and became available as we were posting our position for a postdoctoral fellow with the WashU and Slavery Project. I'm really excited to share that Kelly is going to be joining us at WashU, bringing her incredible insight and just, not just the knowledge, but I think the ethical orientations, the passion for these issues that you can see in her contribution to our conversation. She's going to be bringing that, to us. But I want to stress here that part of what's exciting to me about that is it will really embed in our project the collaborative agenda that I mentioned earlier in our conversation. So we will be able, through the auspices of WashU and Slavery, to continue parts of the work of the at SLU and the relation, and to maintain the relationships and the momentum and so forth that Kelly and her team there were able to develop. So I'm really excited about that. I also want to mention just two other things, and I'm going to put in the chat our temporary kind of mailing list sign up thing, because I don't want to leave without, giving people the opportunity to indicate that they'd like to stay in touch and we can follow up with you. But one thing I want to mention is an exhibition opening in the Olin Library in the spring, in January, called Counter Narratives, that I'm co-curating with Jesse Cerruti, who's exhibitions manager in our library. And the Counter Narratives exhibit is about representations of race and ethnicity, particularly through portraiture. But one of the things we're going to do in that exhibit is trouble the narrative of WashU's foundation and bring to the fore these figures we're learning more about as we examine our entanglement, these figures we don't often talk about in our foundational story. Figures like John O'Fallon, who was a major benefactor and trustee of the institution. In fact, both of WashU and SLU, and probably somehow SIUE, or what became SIUE, but he, enslaved over 40 African-American men, women, and children, at least in the 1860s, and is also a noted anti-abolitionist, a leader of the anti-abolitionist movement in our city. So figures like Shaw and O'Fallon and Wayman Crowe, who we don't talk enough about. So we're going to use the exhibition to begin to tell some of these stories that are going to be important to the WashU and Slavery Project going forward. The other thing I want to mention is a studio lab that Annika Valkenay. Annika's a professor in history whose focus is on Holocaust memory. And we are co-leading a studio lab project with support from the Center for Humanities, starting next fall, in fall 2022, that will be based in the Lewis Collaborative, just north of Del Mar. And the studio lab is part of the Redefining Doctoral Education initiative that's meant to sort of take us out of this old-fashioned way of doing graduate training to really focus on the various ways that graduate education can manifest in the world besides academic research, faculty positions. Our studio lab is focused on this idea of multi-directional memory, thinking across cases of genocide and colonialism and slavery and so forth to gain analytic and other leverage, and the idea of reparative curatorial practice. And we're going to work with partners like the Feldman Holocaust Museum and the Griot and Vachon museums, our own Kemper Museum, and others to WashU and Slavery will be a project partner with Memory for the Future, the studio lab, to develop ideas about some of the questions you asked. How do we engage broader publics and engage our students, and what forms might this work take that can be that contribute to the transformative interventions we need. So I'm excited about those opportunities, but I'm also really hopeful that that this conversation and others will bring more people into the project with other ideas about how we can make this work as meaningful as possible.
Ryan or Kelly, did you want to mention anything forthcoming before we turn to questions?
Just real quick, I will say that our next Sankofa lecture and discussion is going to be in January. We're not going to do it during the holidays. It's usually the last Thursday of the month, and so it'll be in January, and it will be Professor Prince Wells from here at SIUE, who will be doing a talk on African American genealogy. Which is one of the areas that we're planning on focusing on, is more support for African American genealogists in the region. And so Prince will be doing a talk in January about that. So stay tuned. We'll be advertising that.
Yeah, please forward along any advertising. Make sure that.
I will also mention too that our other Sankofa discussions they're all available online. They're all recorded and available online, so I can make that available as well.
Leave it in the chat. Yeah. Kelly, did you want to? Congratulations and welcome. Was there anything you would like to share before we pivot?
Well, thank you. And not being affiliated with the project at SLU and with the Jesuits anymore, I can't speak to what's forthcoming with them, but I will say that Reshonda Alexander, a descendant of people enslaved to the Jesuits here in Missouri, and myself will be giving a talk virtually through St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia in February. People are welcome to attend that.
Thank you all so much. And fortunately, we are already swarmed with a lot of great questions here. So I will read them out so everybody can hear, and I look forward to seeing everybody's response. Hopefully we can get to all of them. This question asks, I wanted to ask about the work done at SLU and at SIUE, and what might be an area for WashU and slavery on enslavement of indigenous people, in addition to those of African descent, not necessarily in relation to institutional histories, but broader regional histories of enslavement.
Sorry, I need to unmute myself here. So something about the entanglement between slavery and indigenous history and the Jesuits in this region is that the Jesuit headquarters in Missouri was a seminary and plantation in Florissant, Missouri, where the Jesuits established a boarding school for indigenous boys in the region. And the boarding school failed largely because the Jesuits were abusing the students and exploiting their labor. We have numerous accounts of the boys being beaten, of them witnessing the whippings and exploitation of enslaved people, that the boys were made to labor alongside and for enslaved people, and they started running away from the schools, or their fathers came and withdrew them from the school because they were being treated like enslaved people. So that's one portion of a larger part of the history of missionary activity in this region and in the West that needs to be addressed. The Jesuits' reliance on the enslavement of indigenous people and people of African descent financially supported the Jesuits' missionary activities in the West, and projects are beginning to form around those issues. There's been, you may have heard of the ground penetrating radar that's being done in Canada and is now, I think, going to be done at Red Cloud School in Pine Ridge to look for mass graves of children who died at boarding schools. And the Jesuits in Canada and the United States just announced a position to begin researching the exploitation of Indigenous people at boarding schools. So that's going to be a new effort in addition to the research on slavery that's already being done.
The only thing I would add is that we debated in forming this initiative how, let me put it differently. We realized that slavery and empire are, and settler colonialism are part and parcel of the same thing. And we've several of the people involved in the project are very interested in these extensions beyond the story of enslavement and resistance and resilience of African American people. It relates to the history of WashU and slavery in our region. We don't have the stories yet specifically to share about this vis-a-vis WashU, although I think some of what Kelly was saying about missionary work in boarding schools is likely to implicate some of the religious institutions that some of our founders, including William Greenleaf Eliot, were part of. I wouldn't be surprised if those connections emerged. The other thing I'm thinking about in relation to the question is how just entangled anti-Black violence and genocide, Native Americans, and so forth is, and in terms of the logic of the racist logic underlying them, but also in some cases the practices and stories themselves. Bryan and I have been part of efforts to commemorate histories of lynching in the region, and I'm thinking of the McIntosh lynching in 1836. McIntosh worked on was from Pittsburgh, a free Black man from Pittsburgh who was lynched in 1836 in a case that implicates John O'Fallon at some point also, who I mentioned earlier. But he was here on a steamboat called the Flora, which had also been used, we believe from our research, that same steamboat had been used to facilitate the displacement of Native Americans from farther north in the Mississippi Valley. And so these histories are so intertwined. And I think I was mentioning this project that centers the idea of multi-directional memory. It's certainly a commitment in our project to do this work of multi-directional memory. And multi-directional memory, the author I'm talking about here is Michael Rothberg. He stresses how we can become sort of engaged in this competitive approach to memory, and you see that in, say, the discussion of reparations, for example. And I think I'm aligned with Rothberg's view that we need multi-directional memory, not only to have a clearer, more accurate picture of our existence, but also because it has the potential to build the long-distance solidarities we need, the solidarities across categories of difference. Our stories are not the same, but we share interests. We share common interests. And the idea of approaching this work from a multi-directional perspective really centers that.
Okay. Well, a question here, a couple questions about reparations, and I think this one sort of maybe encapsulates a few of them. So given what we know about slavery's fundamental role in propelling the early American economy, and to what degree do you believe universities with extremely large and carefully invested capital endowments like WashU should engage in reparative justice actions that draw from immense piles of capital they have accrued? What are some of the ways they could do that?
Well, I think the answer is absolutely yes. The second part of the question about some of the ways goes back to the earlier comment I made about us being in this really initial phase of learning about the story. What is the story? And it's on the basis of that insight that I think we can make informed decisions about the specific nature of our implication as an institution, how we are implicated, and how we might remedy, how we might approach repair in light of this. I think it's critical that these efforts, reparative efforts, be informed by what we can learn about this past. And I also really appreciated Kelly's point about not presupposing what repair, what remedy looks like. This has been one of the things we learned from the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa, for example. People agree that it failed in part because there was this sort of top-down application of the idea of reconciliation, by experts in transitional justice that didn't really engage people on the ground who and center their experiences, their knowledge, their actual interests. And so we want to, I think, avoid that approach as here as well. And sort of related to this question that I just want to speak to is someone in the chat posted about, are we also engaged in raising up members of the community in university who live with the legacies? And I would, and I don't mean to flatten the impact. My point is not that we are all equally impacted, but I do want to stress that there is a problem of collective impact. I think it's a mistake to think of a subset of the population as having been impacted by these histories. We are collectively impacted. We can see in our society today, for example, how fundamentally broken our commons. We don't have a functioning commons in this country. We don't even agree about the truth of the past. And it limits our ability to solve pressing problems like the public health crisis that forces us to be on Zoom tonight. We live in a world where white identity politics, similar to those that rationalized genocide and enslavement and so forth, continue to divide our polity and make it impossible to for our government to function and our economy to function in a way that is beneficial to all the members of our society. So I would say that we are all structurally descendants of these history. We inherit, we all bear some amount of the negative inheritance of this past. And I think this project is one of the reasons I'm excited about it. The whole world can't be boiled down to the history of slavery, but we can use this project, we can use this initiative to facilitate a kind of understanding and reorientation towards truth and reckoning. I think that might have broader benefits as these issues of the ways that we socially embody and reproduce historical trauma is concerned.
SIUE definitely does not have a large endowment like WashU does, or even SLU. but in our discussions as we were putting together our TRHT team and creating our TRHT center, our primary objective was to center the communities that we wanted to serve, right? And one thing we found in talking to people from the communities, especially East St. Louis, was this feeling of distrust, because many people in the communities felt used by academic institutions who came in, and people wanted to use them for grants, use them to study them, use them for grants and then leave, things like that. And there was a real level of distrust there. And SIUE had been as guilty of that as other institutions had. And so we are really making a concerted effort to have this be as community-based as possible, with SIUE providing whatever institutional weight or heft or power that we have as an institution behind these community groups who are already doing the work in some sense, instead of coming in from the outside, dictating, studying people, taking over, applying for, using the communities, but instead using whatever capital that we have to aid the communities in the work that they're already doing, and making them very community-centered partnerships rather than SIUE coming in from the outside, if that makes any sense.
It does, yeah.
One of the capital reinvestment issues really interesting to me is how WashU grew through its lease of land to the 1904 World's Fair. And we are party to, in that way, the racial violence of the World's Fair. That includes this kind of epistemic violence, this cultural violence, violence through the construction of meaning and representations of things. The Philippine Village historic site was just a couple of blocks south of our Danforth campus, and our own Francis Field staged the infamous 1904 Olympic Games that were in part a demonstration of pseudoscientific racism, meant to demonstrate the superiority of people of European descent by caricaturing the other, who, including Native Americans, but also indigenous people and ethnic groups from other parts of the world where the United States had sort of imperial interests, like the Philippines. So what do we do with that? That lease of our land prior to our occupation of the campus in 1905, that lease of the land facilitated not only the rapid growth, so it not only raised money that led to the rapid growth of the campus, the ability to complete the early quadrangle, but it also contributed to the distinction and the prestige of the university. This university on the hilltop campus. And I talk to my students now about this, we are implicated in that. I am also, as someone who was drawn to the university in part because of the resources the university has and the distinction the university has, but that distinction and those resources are rooted in this history of extraction that implicates us today. That's why I said, absolutely, we should be thinking about ways we can use this endowment to engage in reparative justice actions, and I think undoubtedly we will. We will do that. At least we will make suggestions for the ways that we can and should.
And that there's a question here that I think maybe speaks to some specific attempts at least, if not based on capital, a form of reckoning that is specific to Kelly. It asks, in the summer of 2019, SLU Jesuits sent letters to direct descendants of enslaved people. What was the response to that outreach? Were they surprised? any sense of what those people would like to see done, or how they interacted with SLU and the Jesuits. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but I thought that this maybe sort of dovetails from the previous conversation in some respect.
Yeah, so we began being able to identify living descendants of enslaved people around the summer of 2019 and started contacting people by letter and other means from there. And we didn't hear back from everyone who received letters, and some even sat with the letters they received for over a year before reaching out to us. And those who we didn't hear from, the range of responses were as numerous as the number of people we heard from. Several were shocked, some were angry, many because they had attended SLU in the past and now know that SLU enslaved their ancestors. Others because they're still Catholic and were learning that members of the church hierarchy enslaved their ancestors, and it was causing some to feel challenged by their faith in a new way, or having to lean on their faith in a time of great surprise and need. But most people weren't really surprised to learn that they had been enslaved. It was just who had been their enslavers. And on the whole, most people were just so eager to have access to their ancestors' stories and to be able to shape how their ancestors' stories were told and remembered and brought to public consciousness and memorialized and honored. And most people were so eager to have a voice in determining the ways that we respond to this history and its legacies in the present, and began joining the working groups and advisory committees at SLU and with the Jesuits, and speaking publicly on the topic. I know there are several newspaper articles out now showing descendants' responses, which range from seeking monetary investments from the Jesuits and SLU through scholarships, through other reparative efforts, building name changes, memorialization, and making sure that this history is integral to the education students at SLU and other Jesuit institutions are receiving.
Thank you so much. Trying to get to as many of these. We have so many questions. I guess this speaks a little to, I think, what has been a national conversation around monuments and the significance of monuments in public historical reckoning. And maybe, Geoff, you'll be able to speak to this the most since on this campus, but asks, what do you think of the George Washington sculpture outside of Olin Library, which maybe opens up a larger conversation to discuss the significance of monuments or building, the histories of building names and things like that on university campuses.
Thank you for that question. And I teach a class at WashU called Monumental Anti-Racism, a first-year seminar where we grapple with the racial politics of public memory and how commemorative movements are sort of, movements to remove and recontextualize and add new things to our commemorative landscape are sort of, someone I thought described that well as, said monuments are the new lunch counters. They were talking about the Emmett Till Interpretive Center and the contestation around Emmett Till's memory in Mississippi. And they said, monuments are the new lunch counters for our generation. They're these spaces that these charged spaces, referring to how sit-ins on lunch counters provoked the question, prompted a sort of reckoning with segregation, and people are using commemorative arenas to do similar things in our lifetime, in our generation. In terms of so we were talking about, what happens that we were talking about the Washington sculpture this morning, because this week we were talking about universities studying slavery, and of course some of that was about WashU. And a couple of thoughts I'll just share relative to that monument. One is how Washington himself relates to the important question that was raised regarding how we're going to deal with anti-Black and Indigenous violence. Washington himself requires us to grapple in that way in terms of our institutional namesake. And we were talking about various things in terms of this monument and what it means to our students, including, the mythology of, one of the problems with monuments, this one included, is how they perpetuate this mythology of individualism, this idea of the individual, as, and particularly the white male individual, as the sort of creator of all things great that we know and love, and we point to these people. The founders of our institution, of WashU, settled on Washington University after debating other names for our institution, including O'Fallon Institute, by the way. We were briefly named, but settled on Washington University with this delusional idea that no one could ever possibly object to this namesake because he represented freedom for everyone. This was the logic in choosing our namesake. And it of course, did not contemplate the perspectives of Native Americans and African Americans and other people of color who would not have seen then and do not necessarily see today in the same way Washington as a marker of freedom. So, I think with regard to that monument and with regard to, I don't want to, I'm not making a recommendation here. This is not something we've thought through carefully, but I think, I think more so about the Olympic rings in relation to my earlier comment regarding the 1904 fair. But I think with regards to our entire commemorative landscape, the stories we tell on our campus landscape, there is going to be a need for some, in South Africa, Stellenbosch University has a policy of visual redress. Stellenbosch was a nerve center, sort of intellectual nerve center of the apartheid regime, where one of the key leaders of the apartheid government came from as a psychology professor at Stellenbosch. And they're working through how they grapple with the traces of apartheid on their built environment, the built environment of the campus. Things like the signage and the portraiture and the monuments and memorials and so forth. How do they write into the landscape a commitment to dismantling the legacy, the truth telling that we talked about that is so foundational, but also the commitment to transformative racial justice. How do they make the landscape aid in that work? I think we're going to need to do that ourselves, and we have opportunities to do that with things like the Washington sculpture and with the Olympic rings that right now are silent about the racial violence of the 1904 games. They are completely celebratory in nature, the rings and the sort of limited narrative around them. But we can build into that space pedagogically useful content that engages our students, that creates a more meaningful encounter on our campus about the costs of those games. We gained some things as a university from them, but there were costs for us and others as well that we continue to live with. And how do we make sense of those? What do we do about that? So I'm especially excited about, go back to the lunch counters. I'm excited about the ways we can make better use of these spaces to do the transformative work, the healing and the transformative work we need, and not only on our own campus. I'm sorry to go on at such length about this, but Bryan and I think met in conversations with Trish Gunby and Representatives Trish Gunby and Rashid Aldridge, who were St. Louis representatives from the St. Louis districts in the Missouri legislature, who are interested in commemorating the history and legacy of slavery here. Particularly in relation to the slave pens that were downtown. But I think, the thought there is something kind of limited around historical markers. They had words on a pole, there was a slave pen here. What can we do with support from institutions like WashU to create a more meaningful encounter in that space? How do we remember, for example, the children's pen in particular, this pen that Bernard Lynch operated downtown that specialized in the confinement and sale of children, around whom there was a brisk market and all the horrors you would expect of a pen that held enslaved children. I think that's a particularly important and powerful memory to recover and to process, to build a site of conscience around. Because when we think about children, we can't help but think about the future as well. And because our institution is likely implicated in that market, figures like O'Fallon and so on, who were buying and selling and trading, likely did business in that space. So how do we repair? This is a wounded. This left a lasting wound in our community, including desensitization to violence that affects Black youth disproportionately still today in St. Louis. How do we work to repair that, not only through our health and educational systems, but through things like monuments and memorials? So sorry, if you ask me about monuments, I'm going to go on for at least 25 minutes.
Well, we are right up against time, but I do want to give, if Bryan or Kelly, if either of you had any brief comment on the topic of monuments, I think we could slip it in before we take off.
Kelly, you want to go first? Or? Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
We one of our Sankofa discussions was titled "Monuments in the Age of Black Lives Matter," where we brought a public historian here from SIUE, our Civil War historian, and an art historian here to talk about monuments, memorials, the public debate around monuments and memorials. I love that phrase of that these are the modern lunch counters in some ways. Here in Edwardsville right now, in the last couple of years, there's been a discussion on the Ninian Edwards statue. Ninian Edwards, who was the governor of Illinois, statue was sitting on a pedestal in downtown Edwardsville. He was also enslaved, I think, at least 24 people, if I remember right, as well as led militias that worked for Native American removal and burning Native American villages. And there was a group in Edwardsville. There's a group in Edwardsville that was working to remove his statue from downtown Edwardsville. And again, this is not, we were just supportive of their efforts. This was not a USS initiative, but these are the types of discussions that are happening all around the country. And the research, the support that we can give for these discussions, I think is one role that we can take.
Thank you so much. And I want to apologize for the questions that we did not get to. My hope is that this is, because there's so many more wonderful questions, but my hope is that this is certainly not the end to this conversation. And I think if we learned anything from this, it certainly is not. Hopefully just the beginning. I want to say thank you so much to Geoff, Bryan, and Kelly for joining us tonight, and for everybody for joining us for such a wonderful conversation. I appreciate you all and the work that you're doing. And before we leave, just a reminder that the next and final of this final dinner forum of the semester will be on December 1st, considering questions of race, diversity, and K-12 education. So again, thank you all so much, and have a good night.